Well, man, I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. And this is, I think, as I mentioned in my email, um, your work has been just it's been medicine. It's been really healing. And so lately I've been, this last month kind of really in preparation for our chat. I read your book. I've been following as many videos as I can, and man, you put out so much stuff recently. It's just really been pretty easy. Hard to keep up with.
Well, there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of urgency, and so doing as much as I can, really trying to.
Oh, it's amazing. So also the meditation, man, that's been amazing too. I feel like I've been meditating, or at least thinking I'm meditating, for the last, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. But this has something about the way you're describing it I actually feel like I'm meditating now. So that's been
good.
Really powerful.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know where you want to start. I have, this could be an interview. It could be just a conversation.
What would you like?
I think, man, I have a ton of stuff I'd love to ask you, but I think to keep it with a theme, our school, we have a training center that's focuses on what I refer to as the primal arts, right, which is basically looking at all of the essential skill sets that we as humans have practiced and preserved and continued using at some level, either from the perspective that we focus on is like a very kind of fundamental base, like awareness and tracking. These are the skills of perception that people have been doing since the beginning of time, and survival skills, which is the essence of existing and being here. Right. Skills of healing, preserving life, and then the skills of combat. And so those four kind of elements create like this this training curriculum that is the skill sets we focus on. And then we have behind that a layer, just to give you a little orientation to how I'm
please
conversation. The next layer of skills is focuses on the art or the experience of training and growth. And so there's kind of this multi-dimensional and multi-layered training progression. So it's kind of modeled after the science, art, and philosophy concept of, or I'm sorry, I guess that'd be the true, the beautiful, and the good.
Right.
That gave me kind of a frame of reference. So so that's been the way I set it up is we have one class every month, and it goes around for a year-long curriculum. And mostly it's for local folks that live around here, but I do have some people come in, and I'm starting to get stuff online. But so anyway, the where we're focusing right now is a class I call Know Thyself, and of course, following your work, I knew that was important to you. Yeah. And I thought, man, it would be the ultimate to talk to you on that. So that happens to be in what we refer to as the tracking direction. So if you can, think of our tracking courses have essentially 3 layers of depth. It's the hard skills of tracking, and then the class we call the path, which is basically the path of training, if you will. So and then we get into Know Thyself, which is like the philosophy. So
right.
So anyway, that's where we are right now, just to give you a little context. And this is, yeah.
I was gonna say, like, how big of a community is that we're talking about? Like,
You
is
know,
it, go
it's
ahead.
it's been a dissipative structure. So we have people come and go, and it seems to be, you know, we have kind of a base community, but it's also been, um, you know, something that it seems what happens is it inspires people. They have the, if they go through our programs, they kind of get inspired and they kind of go through this cycle and then end up getting released into the world and doing their thing. So we end up having a community, an extended community, but it's not necessarily all here all the time, you know. So
Right.
I have a few students that practice, you know, like martial arts. We do that
Yeah.
consistently, but so size wise, I mean, I would say it's quality over quantity. So
Right. 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 Right.
we've probably had you know, that have been here through time, like deeply, probably 50 to 100 people,
Oh,
and then a lot of ripples from there.
yeah.
So
Yeah. 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 How long have you been doing this?
about 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, the school itself about 15 years, and then kind of preparation before that. So
You,
yeah, and
you,
our
you say we. Who else is working there with you?
um, well, actually, me and my wife, and then primarily I've been kind of the head instructor pretty much this whole time. I've had a few assistant instructors along the way, and but it's been kind of a small thing where I kind of act as a guide in this experience, and then basically it turned. There's a lot of I guess one of the main vehicles for it has been mentorship. I would say
Right. 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 You
that's really
actually
it's
go ahead.
that kind of education. So
Right. Right.
um,
Wow, that's really cool. That's very
yeah,
cool.
so
I like getting into contact with these emergent communities of practice and emergent
right.
ecologies of practices. I find
Yeah.
I find it really, really stimulating and thought provoking. So I'm glad I get to meet you.
You found some amazing ones. Yeah, likewise. So, well, one more thing I'd like to share with you is from your impact is something I found very powerful. And when I say healing, you know, I've had a lot of training in a number of areas that I feel like it's been extremely powerful. And one of them has been with a man named Tom Brown Jr., who's a tracker, and he was trained in the old way by a Apache elder, you know,
Right,
and learned this very grounded and very, at the same time, transformative and even spiritual experience, right? So, and I've been trying to learn, I've been learning from him for the last 20 years. And in that process, you know, um, the teaching style and the culture that it comes from is very, um, I would say, their focus is on awareness, you know,
right,
and their focus is on earth connection, and it's a departure from our Western
right,
perspective. They're a very, I mean, one way to explain it is they're very organized around space. So it's
right,
very, you know, how we're often organized around time. It seems they're kind of a spatial
right,
um,
right.
world, and so a lot of the language and a lot of the teaching kind of has to do with that. But um, there's a reference to what's called Coyote teaching, which is a way of conveying. Well, it's not even conveying; it's drawing people through experiences. You know, instead of trying to give them information and kind of
Yeah, yeah,
download like we tend
yeah.
to. It's a experiential pulling someone through mystery, basically, in ways that they don't even know what's
Right.
happening to them, and they end up putting together their own experience. And so, very what I've learned kind of through you, very Socratic in nature as well. They use
Yeah,
what they use what's called the sacred question,
right.
um, or the art of questioning, and that's one of the main vehicles. So because they're so generative, yeah, they don't collapse on the answer. You know, they expand
Yeah,
into
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very much.
but it's an amazing way to learn and to teach. But what I found from your work is your precision with language and defining terms and somehow building the bridge from a very grounded scientific, you know, place to bridging all the way to this metaphorical realm that I've been accustomed to learning from. So the language I often get to learn through is basically metaphor, you know.
Right.
And it's powerful and it works surprisingly well, actually. But to have this, have it grounded in the physical in this way, or in, I don't know how to even explain it, but it's been very powerful and it's filled in a lot of gaps for me. So.
Oh, thank you. What was the name of the teaching? What did you say, Coyote teaching, or what was it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's cool. I'd like to learn more about that, and especially the art of sacred questions. Well, you can see why I'd be very interested in that. Is there material written down, or are there videos about this, or?
There's, from this lineage, say, there, and this is a pretty broad group. So when I said, you know, 50 to 100 people, that's the people that work seriously with me. There's a whole community, there's a whole underground movement going on that's worldwide. Right. And so there is a lot of material. I only know of Tom's books, Tom Brown. He's written a lot of books, as well as, but they're more story, you know, there's tons of teaching in them, but you can see how, I don't know, that might be a good place to start, actually.
Yeah. So maybe, yes, please send me some links, or that'd be great.
Yeah, and then another reference is John Young, who's another teacher of mine. He's taught courses in the art of mentoring and all of this, and it's been really powerful. So I'll send you both of those.
Please, thank you, Ben. I would appreciate that.
Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to say the value of somehow, however you're using language has been, at least from my mind, it's been really powerful, really effective. So with that, where I'd like to start is actually maybe just asking you to define a few things, even though you've defined them before in your material.
Yep.
But I think for our audience, it would be really powerful. And I'm also trying to get people exposed to your work. So
thank you. No, I'm happy to do it again, Ben.
So so with that, actually, you know what? Could you tell us a little bit about your background in relationship to this idea of know thyself, and maybe it'll kind of reveal why I invited you to.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a long, long story. Where to start? I came out of a fundamentalist Christian background. That it's interesting. No matter how people end up, their religious upbringing goes like it gets almost into your DNA, right? Into your the rudiments of your thinking and being. But I left that form of Christianity because it was ultimately it was very traumatizing on me in a lot of ways, and it became very antagonistic towards Christianity, religion in general. And then in university, I encountered the figure of Socrates in a philosophy course. And it had a huge and profound impact on me because I saw a way of cultivating wisdom and virtue and what I would later come to call, a kind of spirituality. I don't like that term, but we don't have a better one right now. And that had a huge impact on me. And so Socrates is very much for me a sacred figure, in that because there's all these like there isn't one Socrates, right? I mean, there was a historical figure presumably, but there's Socrates as seen through the eyes of Plato, and then as seen through the eyes of the Cynics and the Stoics, seen through the eyes of Pyrrho and the skeptics, or Epicurus and the Epicurean. So there's this huge, it's like a pebble dropping in a pond. There's this huge ripple effect that comes out. And what I saw is that I can return to that rippling again and again and again. And when I do, I see things that I hadn't seen before. And I'm challenged in ways I hadn't been challenged before. And then I go out into the world, and that interaction slowly percolates through my life and permeates through my consciousness and cognition. And who I am and the way I am in the world sort of changes, right? And then after those changes, I go back again into that whole tradition, and I see things I hadn't seen before. And then they afford transformation and transcendent. And so this has just been happening through the whole of my life. The figure of Socrates is it's inspirate. He is inspirational, aspirational. He right and he's constantly encouraging. And I mean that. I want to really play on that word, not just in the sense of motivational, but in the sense of exemplifying and helping me to become more courageous, what Tillich would call the courage to be. So Socrates is doing all of that, but of course he's also constantly challenging any temptation, and of course I'm very prey to it, to self-righteousness or self-importance, and so he has been a constant companion for me in a profound way. And that has carried into the project that he fundamentally sees to be the project that he sort of took, although it's many-faceted, the project he took as his central project. And it goes by different names. It's, he wants the examined life because the unexamined life is not worth living. He wants to know erotica. He wants to know, he wants to know how to care and love deeply and profoundly what should be loved and cared about deeply and profoundly. He wants to know himself, know thyself. And all of these things are constantly many different ways of gesturing towards this core thing that's, right, his love of wisdom. And the fact that he doesn't give an answer to that, but does exactly what I said. He gives you these partial answers that are always meant to take you to the other answers. And while your whole life is doing this, right? That's how he has been and is to me in an ongoing way. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. That sounds really familiar. That experience sounds like much of what I'm trying to describe with Coyote teaching.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that the power of questions. It's like. So, and then also, I just want people to understand that you're also a cognitive scientist. You are a philosopher.
Yeah. Sure.
Those things. Tell us a little bit about your work and how that might relate to know thyself.
So I'm a cognitive psychologist and a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. I've been teaching and researching and writing and publishing and all of that since 1994. And so I do a lot of work around this notion that's ultimately inspired by Socrates of what is a meaningful life, what is the cultivation of wisdom. And surprisingly, those questions, the cognitive science and the psychology have gotten to a point where things that people might not have originally associated with Socrates can now be put into deep discussion, deep dialogue with the Socratic corpus. So as a cognitive scientist, I'm doing work on, the nature of brain functioning or artificial intelligence. And yet it's surprising how getting a deeper understanding of that actually affords me a deeper understanding of the Socratic project. And so what's happened is I've become very interested around what kind of psychotechnologies can people internalize such that they can better cultivate what Socrates was trying to draw from them, try to educe from them. And So, and those are, you can see instances of all of these in Socrates in the dialogue. Obviously, there's mindfulness practices. Socrates could stand in place, like in a meditative state for 48 hours straight, like just profound abilities, right? So that's obviously there. Stuff we don't know about, but it's only alluded to because it was so presupposed in the Greek culture. Socrates, of course, showed great courage on the battlefield. We know he had some martial art training. He's clearly spending a lot of time in the gymnasium, doing a lot of mind-body work. Again, Plato means broad shoulders because he was a wrestler, right? All of this is just so presupposed that they don't even, but if you read the Republic, Plato goes a lot about how the body has to be trained properly. So there's that. There's Socrates' capacity for questioning people, leading them to aporia. There's a realization of how much they're deceiving themselves, such that they might be open to fundamentally restructuring their thinking. So a lot of these practices are now practices and processes that are being studied quite deeply within cognitive psychology and cognitive science. So it's possible, and this is what cognitive science does, because in cognitive science you're often trying to connect up to artificial intelligence. How would you give these abilities into machine? You have to take this weird question, which is this reverse engineering question. So, given this process, how can I reverse engineer it so I can get it down to its basic processes, right? And so, I mean this with the deepest respect, even reverence. We are getting some of the science that will allow us to sort of reverse engineer Socrates. And what does that look like? And in connection with that, I've been working on these two ideas, which is like an ecology of practices, and I alluded to them already. Socrates there's some mindfulness stuff going on. There's there's mind-body interaction, integration going on. There's these questioning, insight practices. And then what Socrates also exemplifies for me is that above and beyond the ecology of practices, and this was an idea provoked by Jordan Hall, I'll always be grateful for him provoking, right? Is there sort of a meta psychotechnology that, collates and curates, right, the ecology of practices? And there was, in the ancient world, there was such a meta psychotechnology that came right out of the Socratic tradition, and it has the name dialectic. The problem is, if people have heard that word before, they've probably heard it in Hegel's voice, and Hegel is much, much later, and he has his own particular post-Kantian slant on it, which I think in some ways is misleading. So what I'm trying to understand, and see, dialectic is this very complex process, and you have to go through the Socratic tradition, right, the Platonic tradition, the Stoic tradition, and the Neoplatonic tradition to try and get a sense of what this is, because it's both an individual practice, right, and also a collective practice. And so a lot of my most recent work has been trying to reverse engineer that with the help of Christopher Massapietro and Guy Senstock and Jordan Hall and Peter Lindbergh. Reverse engineer that and do a lot of participatory observation of very, like, these spontaneously emerged discourse practices like circling and empathy circling and insight dialogue. And it goes on and on and on, right? There's a reason why, like, this is a plausibility argument. There's a reason why it's like convergent evolution. There's a reason why independently and now you've introduced me to a new one, right? Yeah. All these discourse authentic relation, right, practices and communities are emerging. That's a real phenomena that bespeaks that there's a lack, right? There's something missing, right? And so I'm trying to get in. That's why I'm so pleased to talk to you. Although right now I'm doing all the talking, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to answer the question.
That's great.
Right? So, right, trying to understand what's the lack, what's happening in all of these communities, right? Reverse engineer Socrates, and also do the participant observation and try to get all of those together to try and come up with what dialectic might look like.
Wow. Yeah. That's powerful. You know, something you were recently, I watched the your lecture in the meditation series on is it Lectio Divina? Is that
Lexio
right?
Divina, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just as a practice, something you were talking about just remind me of this. I wanted to make sure I communicated that there's something about that practice as you described it. I was like, oh my gosh, that's how we do tracking. You know,
Ah,
that's
ah,
that's actually we use, you know, rather than the poetry, we have all of nature. You know, so
wow.
you're actually making contact. I was doing it last night. You're actually making contact with some aspect of nature and allowing it to, you know, you're going through a similar process. I don't remember exactly, you know, I have to kind of research how you laid it out, but it is this kind of, ends up being this kind of revealing conversation
Yep,
with,
yep,
with,
yep,
you know, that entity and becoming it and all of these, you know, all of
yeah,
these things. So there's all these layers in that. There's just like, which really kind of makes me curious about how old that type of thinking is, because tracking is obviously,
yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, so I mean, the tracking, uh, I mean, there's arguments, right, that that's one of the big drivers of the expansion of
right,
lobes and probably also the cerebellum frontal, uh, uh, that loop, the cerebellum frontal cortex loop. So yeah, I think I would imagine that the practice you do is harkening back to something that's primordial. Lexio probably Lexio Divina um, probably goes back to antiquity within something like the Neoplatonic period.
mm,
Um, so towards late antiquity. And then it's hard to know, and then it seems to overlap and get taken up into Christianity in a
mm,
powerful way. I see Lexio as performing a very, when I talk about ecologies of practices, and you look for sort of design principles. So you want practices that have a complementary relationship. They have complementary sets of strengths and weaknesses, and therefore they can give you a process of self-correction within the ecology. And then you also want layering, which sounds like you've mentioned a couple times, where like I have this practice and then I can layer this another practice on it, because this practice exacts and makes use of the previous. It takes it up into itself, right? And then
right,
there's linking practices, and the linking practices sort of help you progress between sort of the major nodes of your ecology. So if you have like sort of mindfulness practices here, and then you have something that is like has much more propositional content in it, but it's not just propositional, which is dialectic. Then Lexio actually serves to it bridges between dialogos and mindfulness practices.
okay,
So, in that sense, it would be interesting to talk to you to see how, because you gave me sort of four, was it four or three? I know they correspond to true, the good, and the beautiful, but you
oh yeah,
mentioned,
yeah, yeah. So 4 directions. I
right,
actually use the medicine wheel psychotechnology as a guide.
cool,
So yeah, that's been really powerful, and not only that's a whole other thing I'd love to talk to you about, but the way that thing with practice, any of those types of tools, and I've kind of found a very, I would say, core principle based version of it. It seems to get your mind,
yep,
you
yep,
kind of map into it, you know? And so
yep,
I
yep,
actually kind of, after 20 years of training in that, kind of see the world that way, you know? It's this
yep,
multi-dimensional thing. But,
that's good.
uh, but yeah, so we have 4 directions, which would be our 4 dimensions of training, and they have 3 layers of depth each. So there's 12.
Right, right, right. So,
Trying to be
yeah,
a holistic system.
pardon me?
Trying to be a holistic system.
Right. Well, that's what I'm trying to get at within ecology practices. And I'm trying
Right.
to, I'd be interested in understanding a bit more. Uh, this isn't, people mistake this word because they take it to mean the same as sort of making. But when Jordan Hall and I talk, for example, about design principles, we're not talking about like like we're talking about the structural functional organization that makes it work.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk to you about that at some point. That'd be very interesting.
Yeah.
But so, and this is the thing, like, this has also been an interest. I just want to note this, and then I'll turn things back to you. It's been a very interesting thing for me as I've gotten into this and really tried to study and enact and embody this project, Philosophia and, Dialogos. I found, well, that's what's happening with us right now. That although the history and the content may be different, I'm capable of entering into, pretty deep discussions with people from, very, separate traditions. And that also is something that's really having an impact on me. It's like, okay, why is this, what's going on here? Something deep is going on here. Something deep is.
To me, it kind of suggests some sort of, there's some sort of core, either realness or trueness about that. When you see that many, when things start aligning like that, or these seemingly different fields. Yeah. Very cool. Well, I'm going to go back to my questions just to give this a pathway, but I love where this is going. So how would you define, so I'll just make this very simple. What does it mean to know something? And what does it mean, and well, we'll start with that. What does it mean to know something? So I'm talking about know thyself. I'm kind of breaking it down into.
So, I tend to, I like that you pose it to me as a verb rather than as a noun. You didn't ask me what is knowledge. You asked me what is it to know, which I think is a better way of putting it. Because if we think of it as an action, then we can talk more about doing it well as opposed to trying to get final features. Because I don't think there's sort of a final epistemological answer. My supervisor for my PhD described himself as a metaskeptic. A metaskeptic is convinced there's knowledge, but he's not clear there can be a unified final epistemological account of knowledge. And so that has sort of stayed with me. But let's say let's think of it more as something we do. And then if you think about the doings, you can think about virtues within there. And what the virtues are designed to do is to get us into right relationship with the normativity that is appropriate to the action. So, I mean, and this is an Aristotelian point, you judge how good something is by getting at, well, what is the normativity that actually regulates its functioning? So what's a good knife? Well, what's it do? It's for cutting, right? Okay, and well then what's the structural functional organization you need, and what would make it a good knife, in virtue of which, notice the language, in virtue of which it cuts well. So I start with the idea that there's 4 kinds of knowing, and then I try to get at what's the normativity within each one, and then what's the virtue appropriate to following that normativity well. If you'll allow me, and I mean this respectfully, what's the virtue that allows me to track the normativity within that particular kind of knowing? Okay, so I take one kind of knowing, which is predominant in our society, and I think it's oppressively dominant in our society, and for historical reasons, I can't go into, it's in the series, right, is propositional knowing. And this is knowing that something is the case, knowing that cats are mammals, for example, right? Notice I have a proposition, all cats are mammals, right? And so I assert this, and then we want to ask, well, what's the normativity here? And it's this very tortured notion of truth. And what is it for something to be true? And that's probably not quite where, like, so if I start going down that pathway, I'm going to slip into the kind of talk that I'm trying to get away from. So another way of putting it is, well, what's the problem with the truth? Like in propositional knowing. Well, the idea is, well, we fall into some kind of self-deception about knowing. Our biases and our prejudice make us draw the wrong inferences, draw the wrong conclusions, etc. And so what we need practices that give us the virtue of good conviction, that we are convinced appropriately, we are convinced well. And so I take it that, so let me finish this whole thing, right, please. I take it that what we're talking about here is a kind of rationality, a kind of inferential rationality, that what people have to learn is what's called active open-mindedness, which is a way of looking for how particular biases can affect and malform your inferential practices, your inferential activities, your inferential actions. And so what does that mean? Well, it means learning about how adaptive machinery, otherwise adaptive machinery, can interfere with my inferential practices. So let me give a concrete example. It's an easy one, and it's one I like to use. Confirmation bias, right? So when we're making inferences, we tend to only look for inferences that will confirm our already existing beliefs, and we only give attention to the evidence which already confirms our belief. So part of what active open-mindedness is, and it's both, this is where I'm a little bit different from Stanovich, right? It's both an individual practice and a joint practice. The individual practices, I try to sensitize myself to those biases. I try to look throughout the day. I make a commitment at the beginning of the day to look for a bias, right? Or try to look for a set of biases. I'm constantly reading about these biases like you'd read a Bible. Just read about them and read about them and read about them. And then when I notice a confirmation bias, and I do now, I actively try to counteract it. I actively try to counteract it. And I encourage other people to do that with me, right? Give me feedback on it. So I think good propositional knowing is to train your sense of conviction, which is your ability to track the normativity of truth within inferential knowing, to train it with active open-mindedness. And so now there's procedural knowing. There's knowing how to do something. And the normativity there isn't truth, it's power. It's a sense of being empowered. And so similarly, we need to be properly trained so that we get that interactional fluency with things. And this is why I'm so interested in the flow state. What are the conditions that are conducive of flow? Why is it so optimal? How can it be, right? How can it be misdirected? How can it actually, and this is the right word, because the normativity here isn't truth, it's power. How can it empower us so that we have a more skillful interaction with the world? Then there's perspectival knowing. This is the kind, knowing what it's like. This is knowing what it's like to be here now with this particular salience landscape. So one way of thinking about it is perspectival knowing. It's, you're knowing through a state of mind into a perspective. And so it's it's your situational awareness. It's your pattern of noticing. It's what you take to be obvious, right? It's all of those things, and it's just happening for you right now. So what's the virtue there? Well, the virtue there is presence. It's about, so and it's the virtue that they're trying to get into video games, because what you want is the right pattern of interaction. So people, right, are there, but that has to be, in order to get the right pattern of interaction, you have to give people a sense that they're present in the world, that you give them the right sort of salience landscaping. And so, how is the self-deception there? If you've got something like bias for inferential learning, and you can have sort of clumsiness or ineptness for procedural, what's the same thing for perspectival learning? Well, you can either lack presence or you can project. Like you can be egocentric, for example. Many people know what I mean when I say that's a kind of error within perspectival knowing, because you're incapable of taking the perspective of another person. So what we need is, and when you can't, think about what I'm saying here. When you can't take the perspective of another person, they're not really present to you, and you're not really present to them, right? And you can be doing all kinds of this. Language can be flowing, but you know what it's like. You know what it's like when you realize you've been talking and they're like, wait, we're just not in the same world. We're just not together, right? You lack that co-presence. So what's the virtue there? Well, there's a lot of mindfulness practices that are designed to give us a kind of insight at the perspectival level. And so what I want are, right, mindfulness practices that train a kind of virtue within perspectival knowing, so that I more reliably overcome the tendencies to self-deception and afford presence. But my ability to do all that, my ability to generate a perspective, is actually based on it depends on my participatory knowing. This is the way in which my biology, my culture, and my online cognition shape me into an agent and shape the environment into an arena. And it's happening below my consciousness, below my ego, and it's making all of that possible. Because what it does is it opens up affordances for me. Like here, like this is graspable to me, right? And you notice how the culture has shaped this piece of the world, and it has taught me to shape myself to it, so that it's obvious to me that how I should use this, right? And of course, my biology has done the same thing. Oh, there's food, right? And so all that participatory knowing is where all this dynamical coupling, and I want to be really coupled well to the world. So, and what's the normativity there? It's being in right relationship. It's being coupled in the right way to the world, so that affordances reliably and systematically open up for me. What's the self-deception there? Well, it's reciprocal narrowing, where the way I'm inhabiting my agency and the way I'm inhabiting in the world, they're getting rigid and narrow, and they're locking each other down. And that's what Mark Lewis says is going on in addiction. What's the virtue? The virtue is anagoge, where I'm open. I've learned, right? I've learned how to, in a reciprocal fashion, open up my agency and my arena, so that I get a deeper and deeper right relationship to things, that reciprocal opening. And so knowing there is to cultivate the virtues that reliably afford reciprocal openings, so my sense of right relationship and belonging is more and more afforded. And when I have a set of virtues that link all of these four kinds together, that's the deepest, and afford the deep transformation, deep understanding, which is to really grasp the significance, to get, like, to be able to really track and be called by all those normativities, truth, power, presence, right relationship. That's knowledge, but that's where knowledge has finally become what I would call wisdom.
Wow. That was a beautiful, yeah, I actually mapped some of those four and ways of knowing and the virtues and onto the medicine wheel. It's already becoming. I'm already embedding it into our curriculum.
That's good.
So thank you.
If like that, I mean, that's what I learned from cognitive science. If I can build a conceptual vocabulary and a theoretical grammar that allows people to take this as tools into their own theorizing and their own practices and their own aspirations to transformation, and they find it reliably helpful, that's the most important goal for me.
Well, that is happening, sir. So that's working. That's really amazing.
Thank you.
Cool. So, okay, so that's what it means to know something, or a definition. How about we tackle what is a self?
So that's the know thyself that we keep circling back to.
Yeah.
So the thing for me has been, and this is very Socratic, right? It's been trying to draw people out from, get them to move free from a way of thinking of the self that I think is actually detrimental to their flourishing. And this is a notion of self as, well, it's It's a notion of self as a self-enclosed thing. I sometimes call it the monolithic mind, right? That to have myself is to possess a point of self-enclosure, and what makes the self is its ability to talk to itself and possess itself and grasp itself. And I think that is fundamentally mistaken. That sort of Cartesian view, that you have a self and it is sort of completely self-enclosed. I'm going to keep emphasizing that, sort of within your mind or brain. And so the true nature of the self is ultimately is something that is very subjective, subject to you, right? Thrown underneath the subject. And that the self is the normativity of that is to try and remain very true to that sort of fundamental possession. And this is very opposite. All of that, which has become, has become very common language for us. We think of ourself as inner. We think we have a true self, and we have to be true to that true self. And I think this is very problematic. A way of problematizing it is to put it in contrast with the Socratic notion. And I would recommend Christopher Moore's book on Socratic self-knowledge. The Socratic self is, it's not self-enclosed, and it is not something you possess, and it is not sort of already complete and you must remain true to it. Instead, the Socratic self is something that you are aspiring to. The self is a way of talking. I sometimes say that there's ultimately no self behind self-organization. What I mean by that, the self isn't a thing. The self is a way of talking about the way our cognition and lives are appropriately or inappropriately self-organizing. How is the life of your life going, right? How is the self-organizing aspect of your cognition, right? And your cognition is dynamically developmental. You develop as you're functioning, and you function as you develop, because your cognition is inherently self-organizing. So what you're doing in self-knowledge is you're not, your biography may be relevant data, but you're not primarily celebrating or looking at your biography to get your sense of yourself. You're trying to figure out, here's a self-organizing system. What I need to know are, what are the principles by which that constrain it to be self-organizing, and how can my cognition, and here's where you get into the paradox. Well, who's the I? But how is this reflective consciousness and cognition able to become aware of the constraints on the self-organizing, so that the self-organizing occurs better and better? So it gets better at overcoming self-deception, better at zeroing in on the relevant information, ignoring the irrelevant information, better at cultivating, well, all the knowings that we talked about. Oh, I fell into my own mistake. All the knowings that we talk about, right? So the Socratic self is basically, how have you come to learn? How do you, here, let's put it this way. What Socrates is doing is he's getting you to see, where do I commit my resources, my precious and limited cognitive resources, my precious and limited relationships to myself, each other, where am I actually committing them compared to what I say, who I say I am? Because your introspection is actually shit, right? So people think, well, I'll be quiet, I'll look into myself. No, your introspection isn't that good. It's not that effective, right? Well, I state what I most believe. Well, your beliefs don't really capture this very readily. So the Socratic project was actually trying to get people to come to a point, try to get them to a state where they realize, oh, this is what I'm committing to, and this is how I'm committing to it. And then say, is this actually constraining the way in which I am a fundamental way in which I'm a self-organizing dynamical system in a way that's going to lead it more and more towards wisdom. So this, the self is, right, the self is the way in which I would argue your set of virtues, your character, your habits of your deep habits of mind, and the virtues of mind there too, cognition and consciousness, your dispositional elements, your personality, and all of this is not in you. It's all relational. It's how, right? It's how mind and body are related. It's how mind and body and world are related. It's how mind, body, and your mind and body and your world, and mind, mind and body, my world are, all of that, and how it well self-organizes such that this particular, right, mind body, like, flourishes. That's the self.
Wow.
And so knowing that, so if you'll allow me a metaphor, knowing thyself is not knowing your story or autobiography. That information is useful, but, right, your story has actually helped you to become. A story is being a story, because that's what you are in some ways. You don't know a story, you are a story. Being a story is a way of trying to create what I call a virtual engine, a set of constraints so that your particular self-organization happens in a particular way. That's good, but I'm asking people, Socrates is asking people, don't look at your autobiography, or maybe to be more charitable, don't get fixated on just your autobiography. Look at your operating manual a lot more. Look at your operating manual a lot more. Try to understand the principles and patterns of its self-organization, because the way you transform yourself, and also the way you know yourself, because they're bound up together, is how that self-organization is transformed. When you transform the patterns of self-organization, that's how you're fundamentally changing the self.
Yeah, that's really cool. That actually ties into something I forgot to mention, which is kind of the whole focus of this little series I'm making, which is the primal perspective. And that you naturally went there, of course. It's something that drew me to your work. But yeah, it's looking at the principles, the processes as the thing. You know, it's like
yes.
That's really cool. Would you say then that I mean, maybe I'm getting into consciousness now, and that might be too big of a question, but would you say that what we might experience as self then is kind of an emergent property of those processes?
Yes, totally. And what's interesting is, so that notion that we are sort of like a soul in sort of the ancient, like where like the ghost inside the machine, as I think as Ryle put it, because I think there's an older and also a newer sense of soul that we could rehabilitate, which is also to be able to live within it again, to habitas, right? But yeah, I do think that's correct, because when you ask people, how much have you changed in the last 10 years? They'll say, oh, I've changed so much. So much. And you go, oh, how much do you think you'll change in the next 10 years? Oh, I won't change very much at all. And then you ask them again in 10 years, how much have you changed a lot? Oh, I've changed so much. I've changed so much. Really? How much are you going to change in the next 10 years? Oh, I'm not going to change very much. This is the end of history bias, right? So, right, we think of ourselves as we're always suffering as if we're somehow and this is why I don't like the ideas of perfection, that we've somehow, because perfectio, you know, to come into completeness, right, to be finished. So yeah, I think that You're looking for continuity of contact in your relationships. So a continuity of contact that continues to give you right relationship, that gives you presence, situational awareness, that affords you to acquire and apply the right skills, that then gets translated into sets of sensibility and skills for how you move around your concepts, and that's where you get the propositional knowing. So yourself, you should be, because you are. I mean, come on, you like what exists between you and how you were as a 2-year-old is not any kind of identity. It's a continuity. So right, that there's been this process of self-organization, self-transcending, developmental self-organization that got here. So yourself is in that sense constantly changing. It's constantly in a process of dynamic change. But of course, it's happening at multiple timescales, right? Some of the change is like momentary, and some of it is like, it's at all different levels. Some of it's more, like, have you ever had that experience where you look back over the last 5 years and you go, oh, geez, I didn't realize, but I was changing through those 5 years at this level that I didn't even know was going on at that time.
Yeah, I feel like I'm actually going through one of those now, and I think you've actually helped catalyze that.
Thank you for saying that. That's very kind.
Yeah. Something you said earlier too. I gotta check the time. I think. How are you doing? What do we got?
Yeah, like about 15 more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Something you said about everything being in the relational, or I guess that's the perspective of seeing things as relational. I've had a real powerful shift lately I've been studying a lot of complexity theory and that as well, and that'll do a number on your introduction.
Very much.
But really starting to tie that back into my training with the lineage of tracking and all of that, and how they perceive the world. And you hear all these kind of cliche, like everything's connected, everything is one, and all this kind of metaphors, but there's actually possibly, like, it feels like it's getting more and more real to me. Like, I'm just like, I actually see the world this way now. Like, I see the relationships as things,
Right. So you're moving from that, you're moving from propositions that you might even have been convinced were true, right, into, and now you're starting to get some skills, but those skills are actually based on, like you said, I see the world in a particular way, and it actually means that you, right, the way, right, like the way you and the world fit together at that participatory level, it's gone from being an idea, like, and it's percolated through all the four for you, right, and so now, right, it's more real to you because you don't just have the conviction of its truth. You have the power of your skills. You have the presence of the perspective, and you have the sense of being in right relationship with reality. And man, does that ever make things seem real? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, very, very. Yeah, it's been pretty awesome. This is so fun. Thank you.
I'm enjoying myself. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, one more before I forget. I had to tell you this. I just had a little epiphany. This might be a whole nother thing, but in your emphasis on domicide recently, or I don't know how recent that is, but I saw it in your book. I saw, heard you talk about it, and how it occurred to me that, for example, I teach a survival class. It's just a one-day introduction to the survival skills. Right. And my kind of tagline for the class is, it's like going home.
Oh.
And to me, what happened to me in my development through these primitive skills is it's a homecoming. You actually you enter this this world where you are directly connected to everything around you in nature, in a way that it's not just something you visit or something you go do, or it's actually home. It's actually the skills themselves. There's this like reassurance and kind of like this this relief that washes over you when you realize that you can, with your own hands and your own body mind, you can go create what you need to sustain life. out of whatever's around you in any environment, you know. I mean, it might be uncomfortable depending on your skill level, but you know, it's like the potential is there, and it's so the access. I just saw it kind of as one of the healing potentials, maybe of those kinds of skills in that domicide issue.
I think that's deeply right. I mean, you might have seen some conversations that I've had with my friend Rafe Kelly. He's teaching people, like, you know, the parkour in nature, and then the martial arts, and the mindfulness, and then the you know, the narrative practices, and if he's weaving together this beautiful ecology of practices, you two would get along very well, actually.
I know Rafe a little.
You do know him a little. Good.
I met him this way. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that you know, because he talks the same way. He talks about a profound kind of homecoming when people can be resituated back into the environment in which they evolved in, such that all four of those things start to click into place, all the four kinds of knowing. Yeah. And so I'm really interested in the possibilities that we might have at a more systemic level. Because Jordan Hall's talking about this possibility that he talks about the idea that up until recently, the only way we could get the synergistic effects of distributed cognition, minds working together, was to have them physically close to each other. And then the problem with that is, is that we suffer all the deleterious effects of cities. We're cut off from nature, we're cut off from each other, we get automatized, it really affords pandemics, it's really bad on your mental health, etc. And you know this better than I do. And then he's saying, but we have the potential now where we could actually separate those two, because if we could improve this medium and improve the psychotech and the culture around it, we could have the distributed minds working together synergistically, but people could go back to living in, you know, small scale communities situated in the environment in a, you know, psychologically and socially and ecologically sustainable and healthy way. And so that's a really exciting idea that I think we should be exploring now, because again, I meet so many people, and I mean this as a compliment to you, who have what I call reinventio, and the word inventio means to both discover and invent. So you have
exactly
reinventio embodiment and embeddedness, like with what you're doing, and how deeply, deeply healing this is. And you can't tell people from the outside what that healing is going to be like.
Yeah.
It's almost like I can't tell you what it's like to live in Spain unless you go and live in Spain, right? I can tell, and you'll go, oh.
There's a personal experiential. I couldn't even predict it, actually, because we're all so different. That's one of the pleasures of being able to train with people and to facilitate and guide. I kind of say teach, but it's more of a guidance. But I get to set up conditions and environments in which people have interactions with the earth and with themselves and with each other, that, you know, these lessons form, and they get things that I never would have gotten. So I get to learn the most, you know. So that's pretty amazing.
Well, and now we've circled around to Socrates again. When you afford people, when you afford people, like Socrates described himself as a midwife, when you afford people giving birth to themselves in a way that they cannot foresee, because it requires, you know, there are truths, and I mean, you know, all the senses of knowing, right? There are truths that are only realized after self-transcendence and only through transformation. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's really, really the case, that you giving birth to other people is it's weird, because when you're sharing that with other people, when you're sharing your deep learning with other people, that's actually the best teaching. But it's paradoxically, it rebounds on you, and you do some of your own unexpectedly most deep learning. But that's part of the dialectic again, right? Bringing that into human interaction.
Yeah, wow, it's beautiful. Just to maybe sneak in one more thought, one more question. would you say, back to the self concept, does this idea of a self, could it, since it is kind of an emergent process, couldn't the identity of self expand to include other? I mean,
Oh, it does. I mean,
right? I mean,
I think your sense of self, I mean, and so your sense of self moves, I mean, we know this from, not only from historical records, but also we're now doing experimental work. When people have mystical experiences and higher states of consciousness, their sense of self moves around like in really profound and transformative ways. And this isn't just sort of epiphenomenal. Again, the way they are self-organizing changes. You know, the virtual engine of the dynamical system they are is fundamentally been re-engineered in ways that they don't fully understand until it starts to unfold itself through time. So yeah, your sense of self is dramatically changed. I mean, one of the things that right now in my own practice, I get moments, and again, it's like what we were talking about earlier. You put them into words and they won't sound deep enough or resonant enough because the person has to be in that world, right? I get moments where, you know, most of the time, you know, egocentric, everything is self-referential. You know, I'm self-important, import to take in, self-important, all that stuff. And then you get moments, I have moments where I'm ontocentric. I'm actually centered, right, on realness. I'm centered on that realization, being real, the way you talked about it, which is not the same thing as the inflation of the ego. And you get moments where you taste the release from that sort of, you know, that fever hunger framing that we're in all the time and we don't even realize it. But we get release from it in moments of flow or in these kinds of experiences. And you get a sense of a way of being a self that's not, and this sounds like a contradiction, and that's probably very telling, a way of being a self that's not fundamentally egocentric, but ontocentric. And I get you get that sense of, you know, nirvana means to blow out, you know, the flame. You get a sense of, like, it's like you get a wave of relief and release that passes through your entire being. That, right, you go, oh, I get a sense of how it could be, and that's very encouraging. Again, it's very aspirationally motivating. So yeah, I think now you don't want to just dump that into people. Like, you don't just take a novice and drop them into that, because like you'll freak them out, right? And you shouldn't do that. That's immoral. But on the other hand, you know, you got to drop the breadcrumbs that might lead people there, and you got to look for the breadcrumbs that other people have left you, so that you can keep moving towards them.
That's one of the beauties of working, I guess, close to the earth or working in nature. Nature's so honest, you can't really skip steps, you know.
Yeah.
It requires you to, it's grounded literally, right? So
Yeah.
So it seems like the self idea that we're talking about, this emergent thing, it kind of depends on where you want to place this imaginary boundary or distinction, in a sense of what do you want to include, or what do you need to include in that moment. And that's,
I think that's boundaries around, well, I mean, we didn't get to talk about it, but about this sort of deep process of relevance realization. What's inside my frame, what's outside my frame, how it moves around. And, you know, and there's mysterious aspects to me. I can't ever bring the framing process itself fully into my frame. And, you know, my framing on the world, as you said, is constantly being challenged by the world and opened up. Yeah. And so when we go through altered states of consciousness that lead to altered traits of character, the fundamental ways in which we're framing the world, what we find relevant and salient, what we center on, are we egocentric or ontocentric, for example, that shifts around. And I think that, if what I've said is true, if the self is fundamentally the way we're in a coupled fashion self-organizing, then that's what it is for the self to be changed. That process of relevance realization and framing, right, has been fundamental framing has been fundamentally transformed. And so that's what it is for the sense of self to be altered.
That's perfect. I think that's a beautiful place to stop right there. I think that's something we'll chew on. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been really wonderful.
Yeah. So again, I just really appreciate your time and taking a risk to see what we're up to, and maybe we can continue that. But regardless, I just appreciate your work, and I really want to get it out there. So is there anything you want to include in terms of what you're up to? That I know, obviously, there's the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, which has been, I think it's a huge education. And then anything else you want to mention?
Well, I mean, I'm hoping you'll also send me the files for this conversation so I can upload it to my channel as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you priority. You upload it to your channel first, and then.
Oh, I don't care. I'll send it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I also am doing, and this, why I mentioned that is I want to put this on Voices with Vervaeke, where I'm trying to exemplify and also cultivate and talk about, you know, dialectic and dialogos of doing this. So that's happening. I'm working on the next big historical cognitive scientific video series called After Socrates, about what a lot of what we were talking about today, and that series will also not just be like Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where it's mostly sort of theory. There'll also be, you know, exemplification, practice elements in it as well. Because what I want to do is, like I said, I want to try and, you know, reverse engineer Socratic dialectic and put it into deep dialogue with all, like yourself, all these people and all these practices, you know, of authentic relating and, you know, sacred questioning, as you put it. I think that's a beautiful phrase, by the way. I love that. So that's a big project right now that I'm working on a lot. With Greg on Weeks, we are going to be releasing a series of videos that will present sort of my overall argument about consciousness, and he will be interacting with me in a Socratic fashion, because he has his meta-psychology project. That's going to be called Untangling the World Knot of Consciousness, the Hard Problems of Mind and Meaning. And so that's going to come out soon. We've already filmed the first episode. We're going to be doing a sequence of those. And then people should know about, and you mentioned it already, every weekday morning, I do the meditation and contemplation online course. And there's a wonderful Sangha there that practices and an ongoing course. Pardon me?
I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And then associated with that, if people are interested, there's a Discord server. There's over 1,000 people on there now, and it's a growing community talking about Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, Voices with Vervaeke, the meditation class, right? All of that. So there.
Awesome. Right on. Well, thank you, sir. And we shall look forward to maybe hearing more from you in the future. And
if you're asking of my intent, I'm very happy to meet with you and talk again. I would love to do that.
Sounds great. All right. Well, you take care, and good luck in your work.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really appreciate it. A very good time. I always say that it's been good dialectic if two people can get to a place together that they couldn't get to on their own. And I was hearing in some of my answers to you and how they were provoked by you, and I mean provoked in a good way. I was hearing things I hadn't said before. I was making connections that I hadn't made before. So that was very helpful to me. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you. Take care and keep going.
Okay. Take care.
And cut. All righty. Well, there it is.